Hello, everyone. Happy Monday and welcome to week 5. Before I start talking about what we're going to do this week, let me just remind you that the midterm exam will be closed tonight at 11:30 on Connect. So please plan to take it tonight. I can see that many of you took it already. There won't be any makeup, so do not miss it. Okay, and I will post the grades as soon as I can, either tomorrow or Wednesday. But make sure that you go back again tomorrow and Tuesday and check your grade. The grades will be released right after the deadline, so you can actually see the test tomorrow. Okay. All right. So as far as, and let me know if you have any question. Okay. If you have any question, if there's a question that you didn't understand and that you missed, if you have any question about your grade, please feel free to send me an email. Okay. So for this week, actually, again, we're going to be busy. Let me just pull up my notes here. So for this week, actually, we're going to study two important chapters, chapter 9 and chapter 12. And let me also remind you about your term paper. Your term paper will be due on October 5th. Please do not wait till last minute to write it. So start working on it if you haven't. So October 5th, the deadline is firm. I'm not going to change it. I'm not going to give you any extension. This is an 8-week class, so we are in a very, very tight schedule. So October 5th will be the deadline for your term paper. This week, as I mentioned, we're going to study chapter 9 and chapter 12. Let me start with chapter 9. A few things that you need to know. Chapter 9 is about unemployment and inflation. So we will learn in this chapter how to calculate unemployment rate, how to calculate inflation rate. These are two important macroeconomic indicators that we actually have in this chapter, and they're super, super important. You need to know the formulas for them. You need to know their definitions, especially for, let's say, unemployment rate. You need to know how the Bureau of Labor Statistics, or BLS, defines unemployed, employed, labor force. So those are the important definitions that you need to know. Make sure that you watch my video where I try to kind of break out the survey that the Bureau of Labor Statistics does every single month in metropolitan areas to basically collect data, and just watch that video. So there's a survey that they do every month, and then they break it down into the people who are in the labor force, who are not in the labor force, who are employed, unemployed, and that's how actually they're going to calculate the unemployment rate. Okay, and definitely check out the Bureau of Labor Statistics website. All the data that they post actually is free to public, so you can download it if you're working on, let's say, unemployment rate for your term paper. Definitely check out their website. There are the data actually that they report is free. They do it every single month. That's a huge thing that they do. But remember that because of the way that they define actually unemployed, the unemployment rate that they calculate and they report as an official unemployment rate, you can be skeptical about that number, because they do not include the people who do not have a job, but they just gave up looking for a job. That's a huge thing that they do not include in their calculation. We call this population discouraged workers, so they do not include it. That's why some people are really skeptical about the numbers that they report. And to kind of fix this problem, they also report actually and calculate other types of unemployment rate, where they include the discouraged worker, where they include, let's say, those people who lost their jobs because of, let's say, recession. So they have different types of unemployment rate. So they have different categories for unemployment rate. So you can also check out those on their website. They are also in charge of calculating the cost of living, something again that we study in this chapter. Is it this chapter? Yes, this chapter. They also calculate CPI, Consumer Price Index. They use this Consumer Price Index, or CPI, to calculate the inflation rate. Okay, so before I talk about inflation rate, so all this information is on their website. Okay, so make sure that you check it out. Before I start talking about inflation, let me also add something else for unemployment. Part of the chapter. So you also need to know the different types of unemployment. So we have 4 different types of unemployment. Your textbook, I believe, that is combining the frictional with perhaps seasonal unemployment rate. So I tried actually to put the standard form of this category of different types of unemployment rate on my lecture notes. So check it out. There are 4 kind of standard way of defining different types of unemployment rate. We have frictional, we have seasonal, we have cyclical, and we have structural unemployment. Economists, remember, that are not worried about frictional, structural, and seasonal unemployment, but they are really concerned about cyclical unemployment, which is what we are actually dealing with during COVID-19 recession right now, because the cyclical unemployment rate is pretty high. That's why the official unemployment rate is pretty high. So the cyclical unemployment is a result of the changes in the business cycle and is a result of recession. And economists are very concerned about cyclical unemployment rate, and they do not actually want to see at least 2-digit numbers for unemployment rate. The natural unemployment or the normal number, the good number that we have for our economy, and it can be different in other countries, is 5%. We call it natural unemployment rate. So right now, because of COVID, this unemployment rate is way above the natural unemployment rate. Okay, again, be skeptical about the numbers that the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports, because the actual unemployment rate is higher always than what you see. Okay, so if they're saying that the unemployment rate is 12%, it's probably around like 15-16%. Okay, just roughly. Anyways, that's well, one more thing about unemployment. You need to also know what we mean by full employment. I mentioned natural unemployment. What we mean by full employment. So we say that and we're gonna use this terminology a lot in econ, in macroeconomics. So we say that the economy is at full employment. Remember that we defined equilibrium in chapter 3. So this full employment that I'm talking about is basically something like equilibrium for the whole economy. That equilibrium in chapter 3 was the equilibrium for one specific market, competitive market, right, in chapter 3. But when we say full employment, we're basically talking about the equilibrium that is happening in the macroeconomic level for the entire economy. So that's the place that actually we like to be, just the equilibrium in chapter 3 when it comes to macroeconomic level. Okay, when we are at full employment, it does not mean that we do not have any unemployment rate, any type of unemployed, and it doesn't mean that the unemployment rate is 0. We still have some level of unemployment even when we are at full employment. The main thing that you need to know about full employment is that when we are at full employment, we do not have any cyclical unemployment. So we are not dealing basically with recession, okay? And the official unemployment rate is very, very close to that 5%, which is called natural unemployment rate. So we still have seasonal unemployment. We still have some people that do not work because of changing weather. Okay, we still have frictional unemployment. Somebody that, let's say, just graduated from college looking for a job, that person is dealing with frictional unemployment. Or when you're changing your job, okay, you cannot catch up with technology, you're dealing with the structural unemployment. Definitely look at the definitions. Okay, so when we are at full employment, we still have seasonal, frictional, structural unemployment rate. So the unemployment rate is very, very close to natural unemployment rate, but we do not have any cyclical unemployment. Okay, so this is another important definition that you need to know, and we're going to use it again in the future. Okay, full employment. Now let's talk a little bit about inflation rate, and I'm trying to be fast because I also want to talk a little bit about chapter 12. for inflation rate, we start talking about inflation rate by introducing this consumer price index as a way that we can calculate the cost of living, and basically it's about the average prices that people spend on different goods and services that they purchase on a regular basis, okay? And we use this CPI to calculate inflation rate. Inflation rate is nothing but the percentage change in price from one year to another year. So if you want to calculate the inflation rate, let's say for 2020, you need to have the CPI in 2020 and CPI in 2019, which is our previous year, okay? And there is a formula, check out the notes, where you can actually calculate it for those, calculate inflation rate. For those of you who took micro, you probably remember that in the chapter that we talk about elasticity, we talk about percentage changes in quantity, percentage changes in price. It's exactly the same thing here. However, we're just talking about percentage change in price, okay? That's the inflation rate. There are other few definitions for this part, like what we mean by deflation, by hyperinflation. You need to know the two different types of inflation. They're really easy and straightforward definitions actually we have for inflation, okay? So know how we define unemployment, how we calculate unemployment rate, know the different types of unemployment, what we mean by natural unemployment rate, what we mean by full employment, CPI, inflation rate, and all these definitions that I mentioned for inflation rate. Let me briefly talk about Chapter 12, because Chapter 12 is very important. And when we talk about fiscal policy and monetary policy in the future, in Chapter 13 and Chapter 16, actually, we're going to relate all of our conversation to Chapter 12. So in Chapter 3, we talked about equilibrium and how the market works in competitive market. In Chapter 12, we're going to talk about, again, demand and supply, but at the macroeconomic level. So we're talking about aggregate demand. What is aggregate? Means total. So we will talk about the total demand for the entire economy. We will talk about aggregate supply, which is, again, the total supply for the entire economy. If you still struggle with how we define demand and supply, I would recommend you, before you start studying Chapter 12, definitely go back to Chapter 3, review demand and supply, and then come back and talk about study Chapter 12, okay? So aggregate demand is the total demand for the entire economy. Aggregate supply is the total supply in the economy. So in this chapter, just like Chapter 3, we're going to define aggregate demand, aggregate supply. The definitions are very, very similar. But remember here, since we're talking about the entire economy, we're going to go back to kind of Chapter 7 and talk about the real GDP, because we're now talking about the entire output in the entire economy for a whole country, okay? So we will talk about, again, prices, but since we're talking about the macroeconomic level, we're talking about the entire economy, we're going to talk about price level. Price level is different from price. So price is the price of one single good. So the price of let's say a pound of apple is 2.5. That's a price. But when we say price level, we're talking about the average of the prices of all the goods and services in the entire economy. So make sure that you know the differences between these two. So when it comes to aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we're going to deal with the quantity at the macro level. So we're going to talk about real GDP we had in Chapter 7. If you don't remember, again, real GDP, which you should, because you took just a test on the GDP and real GDP. Go back to Chapter 7. And we're going to talk about price level here instead of just price that we had in Chapter 3. So we're going to define aggregate demand, aggregate supply. They're very, very similar to Chapter 3, as I said, but the way that we're going to define quantity and price will be a little bit different. Then again, we're going to put them together, just like Chapter 3, to define our macroeconomic equilibrium, which is full employment that we just talked about in Chapter 9. That's why I told you we will come back to some of the concepts in Chapter 9 in the future. We will talk about shifting and aggregate demand and aggregate supply, just like we did in Chapter 3. However, we are not going to have complex cases as we had in Chapter 3, meaning that we're not going to change the demand and supply. We're not going to shift the aggregate demand and aggregate supply at at the same time. We're going to keep it kind of simple because the result will be very, very complicated when aggregate demand, aggregate supply both change at the same time. This is not the thing that we're going to discuss at this level for macroeconomics. So we're just going to shift the aggregate demand when aggregate supply is fixed, then we're going to shift the aggregate supply when the aggregate demand is fixed. There are some terminologies that we're going to learn in this chapter, like a stagflation. Definitely look at the definitions, what we mean by recessionary gap, what we mean by inflationary gap. Remember, recessionary gap and inflationary gap are these two terminologies are just basically related to the changes in aggregate demand. We're not going to use these two terminologies, recessionary gap and inflationary gap, for changes in aggregate supply. Just briefly, and I'm over 15 minutes. I was planning to keep this video short, but remember, when it comes to recessionary gap, basically we are talking about the gap between the real GDP and what the economy potentially can produce, the actual real GDP and what we potentially can produce when the economy is at that full employment. So potential GDP is the level of real GDP when the economy produces when we are at full employment, when we are at macroeconomic equilibrium, when we are at the intersection of our aggregate demand and aggregate supply. When we are off that equilibrium, it means that we're either dealing with recession or we are dealing with inflation. If it's recession, just like right now, because of COVID-19, so it means that the level of real GDP, actual real GDP, is less than what we typically produce when we are at full employment. The unemployment rate is high, unemployment rate is greater than that 5%, the natural unemployment rate, the economy is slow, so the level of output is low. We call this gap between the actual real GDP and this potential GDP recessionary gap. Inflationary gap is different, and it's kind of the opposite of the recessionary gap. Remember that recessionary gap happens because the aggregate demand is pretty low, and that causes the recession in the economy. Okay, if you look at the notes, I explain more, and definitely read the textbook. Inflationary gap happens because the aggregate demand actually is way too high. Okay, so when we have inflationary gap, the price level actually is high, everything is more expensive. So again, we have this gap, we are off the equilibrium, so the economy is not producing that potential GDP. Remember, the potential GDP is just one number, okay, and it's coming from macroeconomic equilibrium. But when we have inflation, it means that the aggregate demand is too high, so the economy actually is producing too much output, and that causes the inflation rate to go up. Okay, so here again we have that gap between the potential GDP and the actual real GDP, the current real GDP. We call this gap inflationary gap. Okay, we are not going to use these two terminologies, recessionary gap and inflationary gap, when we talk about shifting in aggregate supply. Remember, these are the two only terminologies we use for changes in aggregate demand only. All right. For aggregate supply, when we change or shift aggregate supply, we're keeping the aggregate demand fixed. So we're just shifting the aggregate supply. For simplicity, that we're going to talk about two factors that are going to shift our aggregate supply. Definitely read those factors that shift our aggregate demand, which are very, very easy. And you should remember from chapter 7, all those components we have in our GDP are those factors that can shift our aggregate demand. Okay. For aggregate supply, we're keeping it simple. We're just going to talk about productivity and the price of oil. These are, or resources. Oil is one of the most important ones. But price of resources and productivity are two factors that can shift our aggregate supply. And we're not going to talk about complex cases, all right? So pay attention to the graphs in chapter 12. These definitions that I just mentioned, recessionary gap, inflationary gap, stagflation, factors that shift aggregate demand, factors that shift our aggregate supply, the way that we're defining aggregate demand, aggregate supply. Definitely have some practice for graphs in this chapter. The graphs are very, very important. And as I said, we're going to need them in chapter 13 and chapter 16 for fiscal policy and monetary policy. Okay. Check out my email for the assignments this week, and start working, as I mentioned, on your paper if you didn't. And let me know if you have any question. Have a great week and take care.